Hello, and welcome to Saving People, Queering Things, a supernatural podcast. We were previously known as Driver Picks the Podcast, and the episode you're about to listen to was recorded under that name. Though our name has changed as of season 3, our show hasn't changed that much. Our structure and theme-based discussions are the same, and we're so glad you're here. Now, let's get on the road. Hello, and welcome to Driver Picks the Podcast, the show where we talk about ghosts, road trips, and free will through every episode of the TV series Supernatural. Today, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 10, Asylum, through the theme of suffering. I'm Abigail, your host, and joining me today, for the first time in a while, is my sister Sam. Hello! And we are actually recording in person for the first time. Yeah. This is very exciting. It is now time for our series recap, The Road So Far. So, Sam Winchester is a Stanford student when his girlfriend Jess dies mysteriously in the same way that his mother died mysteriously over 20 years ago. And so Sam, along with his older brother Dean, are headed out on the road to try and find their father and track down whatever supernatural being committed these murders. So far, they've been unsuccessful in finding John, and Sam has been haunted by Jess's death and his own guilt over what happened and over some strange dreams he continues to have. As they search for John, Sam and Dean are actively on the hunt, saving people and killing monsters across America. In episode 9, they return to their childhood home to hunt a spirit that was haunting it, but they're still no closer to finding John. Though we as viewers, we know that John has been keeping an eye on them, he seems to be avoiding them because of some unknown danger, something that is becoming increasingly frustrating to both boys. And that brings us to this episode and to our 30-second recap. Sam just rolled her eyes.
I hate this one.
We also watched this episode yesterday, so yes. We are not even working off of having just seen it. Well, I rewatched some of it this morning so that I would be a little more
smart.
But... Well, 30-second recap. 3, 2, 1. Begin.
Okay, so it starts with a mysterious death surrounding someone who was at an asylum, and then the boys are looking up that, and then they get a text message with coordinates, which they are assuming is from their father, and they argue about that, about following it, and then they go and they investigate all the deaths and kill a monster, and then at the very end they get a call from John. And that's it.
Nice. You got to the end.
I made it.
You got to the end, and you've left some stuff that I can fill in the gaps for. Lovely.
Awesome. Yay.
Okay, I think I'm as ready as I'm going to be.
Okay. 3, 2, 1.
So John sends them some coordinates, and they go to this old abandoned asylum, and where it turns out that this doctor had been doing experiments on people, making them extra angry, and Sam gets attacked by this spirit and almost kills Dean, though Dean takes the bullets out so he can't, and this kind of reveals the underlying tension of this whole episode, which is around Sam and Dean's relationship to their missing father.
Done.
It is now time for us to discuss this episode through our chosen theme, and this week our theme is suffering.
It's a very interesting theme.
Yeah, do you want to lead us off with one of your notes?
Yeah, I think in terms of the theme, I would say that it's more like an internal suffering. There's not really any too much physical. I mean, they always get roughed up a little, but
no more than usual. Really,
yeah, no more than usual. I would say it's more like a struggle internally with the brothers' relationship, and how they both feel very differently about John and their relationship with John, and the fact that he's not around and not responding to them,
but is communicating with them.
Yeah, exactly, is sending them coordinates and sending them on jobs, but is not ever revealing himself or coming to meet them. Yeah, I think it's close to the beginning of the episode where that happens, right?
Yeah, it's right. Like we have the initial death of the police officer before the intro credits, and then then in the next scene, the very first scene with the boys is them receiving the coordinates and having a conversation about it. Actually, they have a conversation first that they have been calling people that they know.
Right.
So they have mentioned a couple of names that don't get mentioned again. They also mention what's his name? Oh, I had written this down and I've now forgotten it. Pastor Jim. Yeah, they write down, they mentioned that they've talked to Pastor Jim and two other people. We can kind of presume these are other hunters or people in their hunting network to see if anyone's heard from John, and nobody has. And then immediately after they get this, they have an argument first about why isn't John reaching out? Why? And Sam distinctly references what happened in the previous episode, which is that they were in Lawrence, that there was something haunting their old house, and that Dean calls John and says, we don't know what to do, I need you to come, and John doesn't come. We also know that from the boys' perspective, we actually know that John does come and goes to Missouri in Lawrence, but doesn't actually reveal himself to the boys and gives a very cryptic answer as to why not. But from the boys' perspective, John is just figuratively ghosting them, sending them coordinates, sending them on hunts, but not actually reaching out to them. So they have an idea that John is,
well, he's alive. They know that.
Yeah, and that he's able to communicate with them, but for some reason he's not choosing to answer the question they really want, which is like, where is he and what's going on? Which I think does lead to that kind of internalized struggle, and they're both having this internal suffering for very different reasons, and they're acting out those reasons on each other in that very first scene.
Yeah, they have this like intense argument about the coordinates and whether or not to respond, and Sam's kind of angry about the fact that they're just getting coordinates and that's it.
And this is the second time they've gotten coordinates, and the first time John wasn't there either.
Yeah, and being like, I can't remember what specifically he says, but it's along the lines of like, he's just sending us places and like doesn't care about seeing us. He's just sending us on jobs. And he kind of makes like Dean just kind of has this blind obedience, and Sam kind of touches on that. And there was something Dean said that I wrote down, that he said, Dad wants us to go, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah, that I also wrote that down. I wrote down that they're suffering under this bad communication from John. And this whole episode is really framed around the difference between Sam and Dean's relationship to John and to orders John gives. Because in that first conversation, and the whole blind obedience, you use the phrase blind obedience, and I'm pretty sure that's a phrase that Sam actually uses in this episode, and that's actually going to be a phrase that's going to come up again in relationship to Dean's like way of interacting with John. Yeah,
and Sam also says something about Dean being Dad's good little soldier.
Yeah, that's later on in the episode, and I want to come back to that a little later, because that good little soldier as a concept for Dean, in the way that other people think about him and in the way he thinks about himself, is going to continually come up. That's going to come up later in season 4 and 5 particularly, but it also comes up a ton. I think the framing for that is his relationship with John, and there are all these allusions in Sam and Dean's first conversation about them suffering under bad parenting, because a child shouldn't feel like they have to have blind obedience to a parent. And we know that Sam obviously doesn't feel the same way. Like Dean says, Dad wanted us to go, that's good enough for me. But Sam obviously doesn't feel like that's good enough, which is why he argues with it. He says, he talks about how like it doesn't really matter what John wants, like they deserve some answers. And Dean's response is like, he's given us an order, and like, of course we have to follow it. And, you know, Sam asks, like, do we always got to follow Dad's orders? And like, obviously that's not true, because when Sam left for Stanford, we know at this point in the season that there was a falling out between John and Sam, because John tried to give Sam the order of staying. John tried to make Sam stay, and Sam refused. So we get this like juxtaposition between the two boys in terms of how essential they think it is to follow what John says. And they do in this episode, they do go to the coordinates, but I think that's, for Sam, that's more about the fact that like they don't have any other leads. Yeah. Whereas for Dean, I don't know that Dean actually expects, I don't think Dean has any illusions about finding their father there.
No.
It doesn't,
and he doesn't care.
Yeah, it doesn't really, like, I think he does care, but he's playing off, I don't care and it doesn't matter, like, I would do it anyway, even if John is not going to be there.
Right. Which I think that's his whole, like, he truly does feel that way, where he's like, I would do it anyways, whereas Sam wants answers.
Yeah.
And yeah,
we've been talking in the last few episodes about how this season kind of draws Sam into believing in the hunting world and buying into this life as a hunter. And at first, like the first couple of episodes, he's really only there he wants to find out what happened to Jess. And then I think he presumably wants to go back to his life, or go back to leave hunting again. By this point in the season, we are not really getting that. Like, he seems to be pretty bought into, like, I'm hunting now, that's my life, I don't like it, but that's my life. But his still number one priority is finding John and solving the mystery of what happened to Jess. Yeah, and this like is one of the episodes where the relationship that Sam and Dean have to John is really growing into a full-blown conflict. They've had tensions about it all through this, from the pilot. They've had tensions about it, but now it's a real point of conflict where they don't quite know what to, it's actually affecting what decisions they're making.
Yeah. And I think it was like tense before, but in this episode we get a lot of talking about it.
Yeah, that's true.
Not just like tense vibes and them kind of being passive aggressive, like this, they actually like talk about it and argue.
Yeah. And this episode deals a ton with anger. And I think that's one of the really smart parts about this episode, is that and about a number of the episodes in this early part of season 1, is that they're using these monsters as ways of mirroring what's happening in at least one of or both of the boys. And so in Bloody Mary, we had the monster, like the spirit. There was this theme of like guilt and responsibility. In this episode, the spirit is focused around anger. And that's where kind of Sam has gotten to, is like Sam was feeling guilty, and now he's still feeling guilty, but now there's this like, he's angry because there's nothing, he's run out of, like, he's not responsible for what happened to Jess, and I think he knows that, but he is angry that he can't find answers. He's angry that John seems to not be answering him. He's angry that Dean doesn't seem more concerned about John's behavior and his communication towards them.
There's a lot of emotions for Sam. Well, for both of them in this episode. Lots of emotions.
But Sam's are really at the surface. Like, I think Sam's suffering is kind of fueling his emotions in really visible ways. And I actually wanted to ask you about that specifically, because I know you are always kind of paying more attention to Sam. Which is great, which is great, because Dean is the one I'm usually paying a little bit more attention to and usually feel a little more in tune with. So I wanted to ask you about what you think about particularly Sam's emotions in this episode and how they relate to suffering.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think anger is always like, there's always an underlying emotion that goes along with anger. Anger is more of a response to an emotion. So I think a lot of the emotion that he's having is grief and maybe a bit of regret and confusion and not having control over what has happened in his life with growing up in this hunting life and what happened to Jess and what happened to his mom and John being a shitty dad.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
yeah, I think there's a lot of emotions going on for him.
Mm-hmm. And he's been dragged
Yeah.
back in, like he worked so hard to get out, and he's been dragged back in. He's lost the most important person in his life again, and now his father is just like MIA, but not. It's not like they legitimately have no idea where John is. It's that John is communicating with them in cryptic ways and not showing up for them, and they have both at different points. Sorry, that's not true. We're getting to an episode where this will be true. Dean has specifically called and pleaded with John to show up. In 2 episodes from now, in Faith, we're going to see Sam do the same thing of like calling and pleading with John to show up when they really desperately need him. And both times, John just doesn't. And we're going to find out towards the end of the season a little bit more of why, but it doesn't really matter in terms of like what's happening for Sam and Dean emotionally and the emotional suffering they're going through with the fact that John just is not communicating.
I think, sorry, going back a little bit to Sam's feelings, I think another thing that is hard for Sam in the brother dynamic is that Dean never wants to talk about anything. So
yeah,
he really pushes his feelings down.
Yeah, a lot of that.
So I think it's hard for Sam to process things because he doesn't have anyone to talk to. And anytime he wants to talk to Dean, Dean doesn't want to talk. And even later on in this episode, after there's another kind of conflict that we'll talk about later, Sam asks Dean, is this something we need to talk about? And Dean just totally brushes him off. Yeah. And so I think Sam has a hard time processing things because he has to do it all internally.
Yeah. And he is willing to talk about it with Dean, and Dean to some extent is willing to listen to Sam talk about Sam's feelings. And there's a little bit of that in a few of these episodes, but Dean is really unwilling to talk about his own. So
or conflicts between
them. Yeah. So
like their relationship, he doesn't like talking about.
No, because I think he knows that there's a bit of a can of worms there of like, and it starts to come out in this episodes of like they both have this different relationship with John, where Dean will follow John's orders and Sam has very distinctly not followed John's orders. And that's all well and good, but then that starts to impact their relationship.
Or Sam just questions them more. Like Dean just follows kind of more blindly than Sam does.
Yeah. And we're going to find out like later in this season and in future seasons, a lot of the reasons why, as a like self-protection strategy, Dean has always followed John's orders, how that's been a way of him protecting himself and protecting Sam, and of protecting his idea of the family unit. So like there's a lot of reasons why, but yeah, I think you're right that like Sam wants to like start dealing with that. He wants to start asking those questions. He wants Dean, I think he wants to some extent, he wants Dean to also admit that like the way John is treating them is shitty. And Dean is not willing to dig into those feelings. And we're going to see him dig into those feelings later on. And we're going to see that be really uncomfortable for him because he's going to have to confront this idea of John and actually admit the fact that he really feels betrayed by John as a parent. But we're nowhere near that at this point. Sam is a lot more emotionally honest. And in this episode, that really becomes central to the plot. So we talked about this a little in our 30-second recap, but the spirit ends up, tricking Sam into an encounter with him and puts it's not really a spell. He has physical contact with Sam and then basically
like some kind of electric thing. I don't know. It's kind of weird.
It's, the mechanics of it are a little unclear, but it basically this head of this asylum was doing experiments on patients to see if by heightening their anger, it could like bleed it out of them. It could actually like by making them more angry, it could like help them deal with their anger and get better. And he was, performing these really horrific experiments on them, and the boys, Dean figures that out by finding some of his old journals. And so as a spirit, whenever he has contact with someone, which happens to a few victims, including Sam, the anger that they already feel is magnified. And so for Sam, the anger that's been kind of simmering, which is directed at John, but is more directed at Dean. Like, he is angry that John has not contacted them, but he's more angry in this episode about the fact that Dean doesn't seem angry about it and doesn't seem bothered by it and isn't willing to question John. And so Sam confronts Sam under this kind of influence of this spirit, angrily confronts Dean about it. And that's where we get the line of like, him calling Dean a good little soldier and saying, "Are you that desperate for John's approval?" And he, Dean asks him to, like, he aims the shotgun with rock salt in it at Dean, and Dean says, "Whoa, like, put the gun down." And Sam, coming back to that theme of orders, Sam, says, "Is that an order?" And says, "I'm getting pretty tired of listening to your orders." And I found that a really interesting thing, because it's not really that Dean has been ordering Sam around in the season.
I feel like it's some projection there. I
think he's projecting his feelings about John's orders onto Dean because Dean is not willing to question them, and because John's not there.
Yeah,
he can't confront John, so he's
Dean's the next best
he directs
thing.
all that anger at Dean, which is really, really rough.
Yeah.
And anyway, sorry, I feel like I've talked a whole bunch right there.
No, keep going, because you're on the track of like getting to where I can continue.
Do you want to do a little bit, and then we'll just so we don't play back and forth.
Yeah. Because after Sam says that, what did he say?
Sorry, my notes are really hard to read if you're not me. So after Sam shoots him with the rock salt and like knocks him over, because Dean isn't expecting him to, and then when Sam's kind of standing over Dean, Dean pulls out his actual gun and hands it to Sam, and like kind of goads him into it, and is like, "You're not going to shoot me," but like is like, "Are you going to shoot me?" And gives him.
Well, he gives him a real gun and says, "This will do a lot more than the rock salt gun."
Yeah.
And Sam takes it, and there's this moment where Sam is holding this gun over Dean, and you just see this real anger in his eyes.
There's not really any conflict. It does not feel conflicted at all. It does not feel like it does not feel at any point in there that he is like struggling with, should I pull the trigger?
No. And like, obviously a lot of that is like what the spirit did to him.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
But I think it's coming from a real place of feelings as well that are all pent up in him. And he pauses for a little bit. Not because it doesn't look like he has a conflict within him. I think it's just for dramatic effect.
Yeah, it's true. And Dean says in that moment, it's also so that Dean can get in this line of like, "You're not going to shoot your own brother." And that is really interesting, the delivery of that, Jensen's delivery of that line, because it's he's not pleading with Sam.
No.
He's challenging him.
Yeah.
He's asking like, "Are you gonna do it? Are you gonna like I've given you the weapon. I know how angry you are. Like, are you angry enough?
Are you gonna do it?
Are you angry enough to kill me?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not John. Are you angry enough to kill your brother?"
Yeah. And ultimately Sam pulls the trigger, and Dean has removed the clip. So, nothing happens, but Sam pulls the trigger, and he tries a couple times before he really kind of realizes that nothing's going to happen. Yeah. So we have that moment where he was gonna do it.
Yeah.
He did it. He tried.
Yeah. This, and yes, obviously, like, we want to be really, like, we attribute, the fact that there's no internal conflict with Sam in that moment, I think, is due to the very powerful influence of the spirit. But I think this episode is using that to bring out the real feelings that Sam does have, and the conflict that he does have with, like, what do I do with all of this anger when I don't have the source of this anger, when I can't project this anger onto the monster that killed Jess. I can't project it on John, who's not showing up. Oh wait, who's the only person who's actually here, who knows what's going on in my life?
Yeah,
that's the only person I can kind of direct that anger at.
And I think also Dean knows he has all this anger, and then on top of it knows that he's under the influence of the spirit who makes him more angry. So obviously that's why Dean doesn't, he takes the clip out, because he knows, and he doesn't even seem that surprised that Sam has pulled the trigger. And he even makes a comment after Sam pulls the trigger. He's like, did you really think I was going to give you a loaded gun?
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking about that in terms of the theme of, like, they've had two or three arguments at this point in the episode about, like, orders and following Dad's orders, and Sam being angry about it and Dean kind of refusing to talk about it. And they've both, like, they're not getting anywhere in any of these arguments. And then Sam's under the influence of the spirit, and he is saying all of these things. And, I wonder, in terms of suffering, like, Dean doesn't have to play it that way. Like, he clearly had the plan of, like, as soon as I can, I'm gonna get the jump on him and, like, knock him out, or, like, knock him over, so that I can go find the spirit and end this. So, like, clearly that was always the plan, was he had to incapacitate Sam in some way so he could go and deal with the problem. The whole sequence where he pulls out the gun and gives the gun to Sam, I think I don't think he's asking for this suffering, but he is asking for the truth. Like, he's asking to know, like, if Sam's anger was really turned up to 100%, if Sam didn't have any internal conflict, like, how angry is Sam really? And then Dean gets this big heaping of internal suffering of, like, like, he doesn't, how much is that? How much, because he doesn't know how much is the spirit and how much is Sam's anger.
Yeah, and I think moving on to, like, a little later in the episode, where Sam apologizes for what he said, and Dean kind of is like, oh, you remember? And I think that's a moment where Dean was like, oh, it wasn't all. Maybe it wasn't all the influence of the spirit. Maybe some of those things were actually big feelings that Sam was having.
Yeah, I wonder when you said that, I wonder if Dean thought that Sam wouldn't remember.
Right.
And that it was only going to be something, like, Dean would know. Dean would know. Maybe have a glimpse into Sam's true feelings and Sam's true internal suffering and the anger there. But he didn't expect Sam to remember.
Yeah, he seemed surprised. And, after that, Sam says, I didn't mean anything. I didn't mean any of it, right? Yeah. And Dean kind of is like, yeah, and Dean does
not seem to believe him.
No. And that's when Sam is like, do we need to talk about this? And Dean blows him off.
Yeah, Dean says, what Dean actually says, I don't remember what he actually says.
We don't have time or something like
that.
He
says, I really don't. He says he does not want to.
Oh, right.
He's like, I don't, it's actually one of the more, like, honest points that he has in this episode, where he's just like, I don't want to deal with this right now. Like, I do not want to have that conversation. Because, and again, I think that maybe is the sense of, like, they've, like, this episode, there's no real progression. Like, in Bloody Mary, when they kind of deal with a lot of Sam's guilt feelings about Jess, there's this progression between the two of them of, like, at the beginning of the episode, Sam's really, really lost in this guilt. And by the end of the episode, they have a really productive conversation about it not being Sam's responsibility, what happened. And this episode, they go in a big old circle. Like, the only thing they find out in terms of their interaction with each other, and in terms of, like, they don't resolve anything. Like, they end this episode with the feeling of, like, if we talk about this, and I think that's maybe why Dean says he doesn't want to talk about it, because he realizes that if they do, they're just going to end up in another shouting match with each other. Like, they're not any closer to solving this question of like,
yeah, neither of them are really in the space where they can be productive about it at this point.
No. Sam's too angry and Dean's too repressed.
Yes.
Like, Dean's not willing to question John, and Sam's
too
angry to
be rational
about it. And I think that's like very reasonable given their both of their experiences and the suffering that they're both internally going through, because like Dean's just experienced in episode 9 calling his dad and pleading with his dad, which we're going to see later on. Like, Dean doesn't show a lot of emotion around his dad in really almost any of the interactions he's going to have in the future with his dad. Even some of the flashbacks, we see kind of a pretty tight lid on his emotions when it comes to John. And so for him to call John and plead with him is an emotional plea to John, and it doesn't work. And so that hurt him, and he's not willing to deal with that. And Sam, I think, recognizes that, like, and Sam even mentions, like, we called Dad from Lawrence and Dad didn't show up. Like, I think he wants Dean to like join him in being angry, which is a very legitimate desire. And so they're both internally suffering, and they just don't have the ability to communicate about that suffering.
Yeah, totally.
I have 2 more notes / questions for you in relation to the theme. So the question of suffering, because when they're doing their investigation, they're trying to figure out who is responsible for like these deaths. And originally they seem to think it's the patients, that the patients who rioted their spirits are angry and they're attacking people. And there's this kind of like question of like, which is kind of one of those age-old questions of like, do hurt people, like, are they inevitably going to hurt other people? Like, do people who have had suffering inflicted on them, are they destined to inflict the same kind of suffering on others? And I really appreciated, and I wanted to know like what you thought about that in terms of this episode, because it turns out it's not those people. It's not the patients who are hurting people.
Yeah, that's true, because that's what they originally think. Because they kind of connect that to anger. They're like, oh, these people had these awful things happen to them. They must be angry. The spirits must be angry. So they must be the ones who are causing these murders. And then we realize after, and it's Sam who realizes, because
he's emotionally tuned into this.
Yes. Realizes that the spirits that are coming to them are not don't want to hurt them, that they are wanting to communicate and give them information about what's actually happening, that it's not them who are the problem, it's
the person who caused their original suffering.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
This doctor.
Yeah. And even just in that, it shows that the spirits they don't have that anger piece. They have that, like, they just want to warn the people so that they're not going to suffer like they did.
Oh yeah, it's almost a warning. Yeah, because they don't really explicitly address in the episode like why the other spirits interact with people that come in here. So like they interact with Sam and they interact with the others. I think they do kind of address this with the teenage girl that's there, where they tell her like, you just need to face the spirit that's locked her in a room. And like you said, these spirits are not trying to cause suffering to others. They just want their own suffering recognized, and they want to warn them against the actual cause of the suffering, which is this psychopath doctor. Which I like that answer to the question of like, do people who have suffered inevitably cause suffering to others? Because other times in the show we're going to see that being the case. We've already seen that being the case, but I appreciate that appreciate that in this episode that's not the answer.
Yeah.
It's not victims victimizing others. It's the perpetrator just continuing even in death to be a perpetrator.
Yeah.
My last kind of note on theme is that there's a little bit of a theme of facing suffering, like your own knowledge, which kind of ties to what we just said. But Sam visits this psychologist to get information, and we get Sam like avoiding talking about his suffering. And Sam, the psychologist, tries to ask Sam about his real feelings about his brother, about his real, like what's really going on. And it's kind of a cut scene we don't get to see, but it's interesting how I think Sam's reaction to his suffering is mostly to channel it into like anger at this point, because he doesn't know what else to do with it, and to avoid, well, like you said earlier, anger is usually a front for some other emotion. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the most natural front to Sam for his.
Yeah, that's true. And that continues for a while for him.
I would say that continues throughout at least half of the show.
Yeah.
As like the most, and like probably the whole show really, but like throughout the first probably solid like 7-8 seasons, anger is going to be a thing that's going to really be how Sam processes a lot of stuff, for better or for worse, and has something that he's going to have to continually face is like, am I facing my grief, or am I channeling it into anger and then directing that anger at myself or at those around me?
Yeah,
it really sucks. Sam's experience in this episode is really sucky. We'll cover some of the remaining things in our next segment, which is our Going Meta segment. We're going to talk about some of the show's lore, track some elements of the show that we're paying attention to. And yeah, so first off, significant deaths.
There's not really any like, I mean, there aren't a lot of characters.
No, there aren't.
So there are no significant character deaths.
Yeah, the closest we get to that is that Sam tries under the influence of the spear, which is, I think, it's not actually a death, but it's the first time in the show. It will not be the last time, but it's the first time in the show that one significant character tries to kill another significant character. So that's something that we're gonna see that again.
Yeah.
Sometimes influenced by a monster or spirit, and sometimes not.
Drama.
So much drama. I mean, that's mostly what this show is about.
It's about
supernatural monsters and interpersonal drama. And people being bad at dealing with their emotions. Second is the Bechdel test. Does this episode pass, Sam?
Nope. Does not pass. There's literally one female in the whole show.
Yeah, that's
the whole episode.
Well, there's also the police officer's wife in the beginning scene who has like 2 lines. But she has 2 lines and it's not too
And
hard.
then she dies.
So not every female character in this episode dies, but it does not pass the Bechdel test.
No.
Third is our lore check. So what are some connections to like the broader world of the show and things the show is setting up? So I have a couple of notes, and I know you also had the note you mentioned earlier to me. We get, again, a confirmation that Dean really knows the journal because he remembers where to find very specific information based off of like very specific locations that they're talking about and like hints that they get, which I just found, again, Dean's very competent, and we're getting more and more hints of that and explicit things of that. So we also have the idea of like some kind of possession often being symbolized and shown by someone's like nose or eyes bleeding, which we're going to get with lots of different kinds of monsters.
Right.
I don't know that this is the first time that has happened. It's one of the first times that's happened. And the third thing I noticed is that we really have a lot of different ways that spirits die in this first season. Like later seasons are going to be a little more like a poof of flames and the spirit's dead. This one, like the spirit like kind of crumbles into nothingness. It kind of, they were trying many different horror tropes in this season.
We had a little laugh about that when we were watching it, because we were like, oh, all right, this is a new way for a spirit to die. There's no consistency.
No consistency. I think they were being creative, and then they will stop being as creative later on. Maybe the special effects, they were like, we don't want to spend so much time and money on that. I don't know.
Oh yeah, the thing that I had written down was all the jokes and the comments that Dean and Sam, the conversations they had about Sam's dreams and kind of his weirdly psychic abilities that they're just starting to notice, that will become more prominent as we go along in the show, where Dean like makes this joke where he's like, that whole freaking ESP stuff, and kind of has a little chuckle about it, and Sam gets a little bit defensive and is like, oh, it's just, you know, strange vibes and
which I thought was such a funny line.
Weird dreams and meh.
Yeah. Well, it's in the context of they're just figuring out, they're in this mental hospital where there's all these sort of like angry, disturbed spirits, and Dean is kind of like half jokingly, half seriously, like warning Sam, being like, you know, spirits are attracted to that whole freaky ESP thing. Like, watch
yes,
it, which is an interesting foreshadowing for what's going to happen later in the episode.
Right.
But yeah, Sam, I think, really wants to play it off.
Well, we get
just fair.
You know, it goes kind of back to that whole thing where Sam just really wants to be normal.
Yeah.
And he's not, and he can't be.
But at this point, he doesn't know why.
No, and he doesn't know why. But just in general, in his life, he hasn't had a normal life, and there's always that internal struggle for him.
Yeah.
And then with all these, you know, strange dreams and abilities that he's starting to have, I think it's just freaking him out. So he's trying to just brush it off.
Yeah. He's trying to just be like, it's just strange vibes, just like dreams, because I have all this trauma. It can't be anything else, because if it's anything else, that's way more terrifying.
Yeah.
And I think Dean's also, that's why Dean, and for Dean, I think that's why Dean jokes about it, because he's joking about it because he really is afraid that there is something going on beyond just, you know, Sam having nightmares. He's like afraid that there's something more to it. And there is something more to it. We're not going to know that for a while, but it is a really interesting, it's a really interesting connection to the way we're kind of getting to know Sam, particularly. Like we're playing a really slow burn with finding out about his abilities.
Yeah.
So next up we have locations. Places this season was filmed. Do you recognize anything from this episode?
No, I didn't recognize anything. I mean, I know that it
mostly takes place in the asylum.
Yeah. I know that the asylum is in kind of the lower mainland.
Yes, I'm just pulling it
area.
up right now. So the asylum, this isn't a place where they're actually going to film quite a few episodes. It's an old was a mental hospital in Coquitlam, and they're going to use it a number of times. It's no longer being used. I mean, like a lot of mental hospitals of that era, it has its own, you know, kind of troubled history. But it's not a location I've actually been to.
No, me neither.
Next up, we have pop culture. Anything you noticed? You can. If you want to take one of these.
Yeah, I mean, Dean makes a lot of jokes about horror films and
so very meta today.
It being freaky in the asylum, and, you know, referencing The Shining, and when talking about Sam's dreams and abilities, he just makes a lot of jokes, and
it's so interesting. Dean's so interesting in terms of how he relates to pop culture, because like their whole life has been like in a lot of ways a giant horror movie. And Sam really, like, we have not in this episode but in other episodes in the past and in the future, Sam's going to express a real aversion towards like the horror genre, which kind of makes sense. He's like always wanted to get out of this life. He's never wanted this to be his life. So he doesn't, he's like, my whole, and I think he says this at one point in a later season. He's like, our whole life is a horror movie. Like, Sam really hates Halloween, and we find that out in a couple of seasons, and he talks to Dean about it, and Dean's like, why don't you like this stuff? And Sam's like, our whole life is a horror movie. And Dean has gone the opposite direction, where he's like leaned into the horror aspects of their life and is like, no, I love like The Shining and like all of these classic horror things, which is I just find really funny that they've taken these opposite tacks, and Dean likes to like make jokes about horror movies in there.
Yeah,
it's very meta. It's really funny. Dean also compares John's writing in the journal to Yoda, which I thought was funny. Continuing with the Star Wars. This is at least the second explicit Star Wars reference we've had, because they also used the pop culture. They also used Ford and Hamill as aliases in the very first episode. So we've confirmed that Dean definitely likes Star Wars.
Yeah.
Very apt for his age, born in 1979. So
yeah.
Lastly, we have a gaydar radar. Did you notice anything in terms of the relationships in this episode, or ways that heterosexuality is constructed, or just anything that you noticed related to this?
This is a good question. You didn't have this before.
No, this is one we've added in the last couple of episodes. Sorry, I should have prepped you for it.
I like it. I'm trying to think.
We have the classic horror movie trope, and the classic trope in a lot of movies of the teenaged, couple. They're very straight. They're very heterotypical.
Yeah.
There's not as much in this episode as there is in other episodes.
No, there isn't. I mean, there's the one, like, kind of thing where Sam is asking them if they know how to use a gun, and the guy is like, no, of course not, and the girl's like, yep, I'm good.
That's true. That's disrupting of a norm.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah,
I feel like that might be the only one.
I think that might be the only thing in this episode. This episode's not so much focused on that, because it's so focused on the internal stuff that's happening with Sam and Dean.
Yeah,
but yeah, if anyone listening has noticed something that we didn't notice, feel free to let us know that. We would love to hear.
Yeah.
We have one more segment today, and today that's kind of our looking forward segment. So what are we looking forward to? We are almost halfway through this season, which is super exciting. We've got one more episode, and then we'll be officially halfway through this season. What have we enjoyed so far about how the season is unfolding, and what are you looking forward to? You and I talked a little bit in the pilot episode about things we were excited about. How has that kind of played out so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, if I'm remembering, I think one of the things that I said was just their developing relationship, and we've definitely seen that. I mean, it's really tense right now. There's not a lot of resolution with a lot of their issues. But that's something that we'll continue to see. It's just them, figuring out the relationship and dealing with all their issues. The other thing that I'm excited to see is more of, again, Sam, because he's my favorite, is more of seeing what those kind of abilities and weird dreams and what that is with him, and kind of getting more background on that. I really like that storyline with him. So,
and it's a really slowly unfolding storyline. I think that's something that I always forget when you get into later seasons, because so much of that gets really established. But at this point, we really just don't know.
Yeah,
we don't know what his abilities are, if he's really even got abilities. We know he has these weird dreams, and we don't know if they're significant or not.
Yeah, they don't give us much.
No, it's a very slow burn this season.
Yeah.
I think that's similar to what I've observed so far this season, is that I really appreciate how this season slow burns us through a lot of character development. Like, we have spent this first 10 episodes getting to know these boys, but we haven't, I don't feel like the show has like info dumped a ton about them. Like we are getting bits and pieces of what was their relationship like with their dad, what was their relationship like with each other, what are they like as individuals. We've gotten more of, I would say, Sam at this point. We've only had a little bits and pieces of Dean. We've gotten mostly Dean as Hunter. We haven't got as much of him as a person other than in episode 9. But I think what I'm looking forward to is to kind of continually see that unfold of like how the showrunners and the writers are showing us who these characters are through unraveling the mystery of this season. Obviously the end of this episode ended with John calling them.
I was just remembering that.
So we are going into episode 11, and we are going into, hopefully, well, and we know this as people who have watched the show before, we are going to be getting some, if not answers, at least some more significant breadcrumbs about what's happening with John. And that's really exciting. I'm looking forward to getting to talk about their relationship with John and their relationship with each other with a little bit more concreteness, because we actually have some interactions with John. This is going to be only the second time we've really seen John in the present day, other than when he showed up with Missouri. But this is like one of the first actual interactions we're going to see between John and the boys.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to see how that shifts, how that kind of propels the story forward. Yeah, it's exciting. And we're coming up on a couple of my favorite episodes. We're coming up on my favorite episode from season 1 in 2 episodes, which is Faith. And then
that's a good one.
Yeah, Faith is I think one of the best episodes in the whole 15 years of the show. And anyway, I'm really excited about it. I won't spoil all of the things I'm going to say about it, but I am really looking forward to this back half, because I think there's some really solid episodes, both of Sam development and of Dean development, and it's going to be really fun.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me again.
Yeah, so it's so fun. I'm looking forward to getting to record a couple more, hopefully in person this summer.
Yes.
To anyone listening, thank you for coming along for the ride. We wish you a peaceful road until we meet again. Next week, we hope you'll join us. We will be discussing season 1, episode 11, Scarecrow, through the theme of heroism. A note to our listeners. This episode was recorded prior to our season 3 name change, where we went from Driver Picks the Podcast to Saving People, Queering Things. For all of our new social media platforms, visit queeringthingspodcast.com.